Welcome to our webinar today. Just to start off, as always, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Ugarapul and Kidawul peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to acknowledge if there are any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us today. Thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third webinar of our four-part online series, Fight the Fawn, People Pleasing. So this forms part of our online series called Tackling Taboo Topics. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I'm Tina Biro, and I'm a facilitator and coach here at Performance Frontiers. For those of you that do know me, hi again. So glad you guys could join us. I am seeing some familiar faces, which is fantastic. And I'm also thrilled to be joined by my awesome colleague today, Jonas.
Thank you, Tina. Hello, everyone. I'm a coach and facilitator at Performance Frontiers as well, and this topic is a super interesting one. I'm so excited to take you all through it. A few housekeeping pieces before we kick off. Just a reminder, we are recording the sessions as we do so that people can come back and take value from them afterwards. If you can please have your cameras on during the session, just so that we can keep track and check in with you throughout the session, and keep yourself on mute. If you have any questions as we go, do use the chat box or the comment section for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonas. I just want to reiterate that this session will be quite interactive despite being a webinar. So whilst we are on mute, just inviting you all to be ready at different points to add some comments and thoughts into the chat. So let's start off by thinking about, and I'd love to ask you some questions around, have you ever found yourself agreeing to something that maybe you didn't want to, making a promise that you didn't quite want to make just to keep the peace? Or have you ever found yourself staying quiet in meetings even though you had something you wanted to voice? Or maybe there was a crunchy conversation that you needed to have and you kind of find yourself avoiding it. Maybe it's just a feeling of exhaustion or noticing that you're constantly putting other people's needs ahead of your own. Now, as I was asking some of those questions, I did see some people nodding along. Obviously, if we see the number of people on this call, and myself and Jonas, we're not alone in this. This is quite common in terms of people pleasing that shows up for us. And it's often at the expense of our own boundaries. It's at the expense of ourselves. And so, at Performance Frontiers, for those of you who are familiar with our work, and for those of you who aren't, we've worked with a number of leaders and teams from all walks of life. So all the way from our seasoned, execs, all the way to emerging leaders and team members. And this is definitely a common challenge that we see time and time again, where people tend to prioritize others' needs above their own, and it starts to impact their not just personal but professional life. So today, that's what we're diving into. We want to look at where it comes from, its impact on our both professional and personal life, as well as our well-being, and most importantly, I think why we're all here is, what can we do about it? How do we break this cycle? So today's all about reclaiming our voice, so to speak, and learning to start saying yes to ourselves. I know it sounds a little bit cheesy when I say it, but it's true in essence. We want to start saying yes to ourselves, not just other people. And how do we balance those two things?
Great. So Tina's given us the path ahead for the session, and I want to have us kick off. Let's watch a quick little video about people pleasing. This is a light-hearted way to see some of the behaviors that we're going to be exploring throughout today.
Hey, what's up, man? You okay?
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm just, Frank texted me if we could use my car this weekend, but I need my car this weekend, so, screw it. I'm just gonna rent a car for myself this weekend, and I'm just gonna, yeah, I'm figuring out what to do.
Why don't you just tell him you can't use your car for the weekend?
Yeah. I'm just gonna write like a little paragraph over explaining how we can't use it because, I got this thing going
Oh
on.
my God,
and,
no, give me this. No.
He's gonna hate me forever. Yep, he's gonna hate me. He's gonna hate me forever.
He said, okay, no problem, I'll just rent a car.
Oh, okay.
See? He doesn't care.
You know what? Actually, text him. I can cover the rental that he needs for the weekend.
Okay, stop. You really gotta work on your boundaries, dude.
What are those?
Thanks, Tina. So I saw a few smiles, a few laughs, perhaps knowing nods as we showed that little video. Would love to hear for you to share in the chat box. What did you find relatable about that video? Can you recall a time where you remember acting similar to the character in that video? What were you thinking or feeling in that particular moment when that came up? So just pop some of your comments in the chat box. That's how I think. That's over-explaining. Feeling guilty. Yep. Always put myself last. Yeah, absolutely. So as a recovering people pleaser myself, I really found the relatable part that even if I have moments where I feel proud and I'm like, I've said no, that's fantastic, kind of backpedaling in my mind afterwards and questioning myself. So it's great to see everyone else's responses resonating there. Tina?
Yeah, I love it. And it's interesting how many of us could actually relate to this video. It just shows that people pleasing often shows up in small everyday ways. And sometimes we don't even realize that that's what we're doing. It's much easier to identify when it's externally reflected back to us. So what we want to do now is have a think about and go through some of the different ways it can actually manifest for us. And now, before I share some of these ways, as I go through the list, what I would invite you all to do is mentally check off any that feel familiar or that really resonate. These are the ways that it might show up for you. And then what we'll get you to do is type it into the chat after. So here's our list. We've got saying yes when you want to say no, over apologizing for something small, offering to help even when you're overwhelmed, avoiding conflict at all costs, feeling guilty for saying no, agreeing to something just to avoid disappointing others, changing your opinion to match someone else's, smiling when you're actually upset or frustrated, agreeing to take on extra work just to be seen as helpful, worrying about what others think of you, avoiding saying no because it might upset someone, or putting other people's happiness above your own well-being. Now, I'm curious if you were following along and mentally ticking off how many numbers did we tick off in the chat? I know for me, as I was going through that, there was lucky number 7. What about for others? What came up? How many did we tick off? 6? Yes. What about you, Jonas?
I would love to say 0, but of course, I think I might have hit 8 actually. So I've got you beat, Tina.
Oh, competition, most of them.
Most of
Yeah.
them.
They're all very
Yep.
relatable.
They are. So great. We'll see all of them. Yeah, absolutely. So this exercise can help us see that while people pleasing can look a whole lot of different ways, it can show up differently for all of us. It generally boils down to one core issue, which is prioritizing other people's needs above our own. And as we move forward, we're going to work with a particular definition today for you. And that is that prioritizing, people pleasing is prioritizing other people's needs and approval over our own, often avoiding conflict or to gain acceptance. And here's the important one, even at the expense of our own well-being. I think that's really that distinction between when it might be genuine caring and people pleasing. So let's go a little bit deeper and pause for a moment to understand the difference between intention and default when it comes to people pleasing, because you might be asking these questions even as we show you that definition. Intention is when you consciously choose to help or prioritize someone else who might need your care or need your attention. And you're doing that because you genuinely want to. And this you can tell because it comes from a place of self-awareness and purpose. Default, on the other hand, if you're coming from that place of default, what's distinguishing here is that you're often automatically falling into that response in a way that puts others first. So you might find yourself saying yes, not just once or twice, but to just about anything that comes your way. And you might be doing that to avoid conflict, to seek approval, whatever that might be. And the key is it's driven by a habit often, and that might be a fear or essentially not a conscious choice is the distinguishing feature there.
Yes, I love this distinction, Jonas. I think the key here for me is that it's not the intention, like that where we want to help or support others, that needs to change. Rather, what we want to catch and what we want to mitigate is the default one. It's where we over-index and we find ourselves being pulled into over-prioritizing others' needs above our own. And it's this default mode that quite often gets us into trouble, or that brings us the challenges associated with people pleasing. It's not the intentional choices where we want to be helpful. So this is what we want to expand our awareness into, where we begin to be mindful when it's default and become discerning around that, begin to pause and reflect and move into making intentional choices, both that in alignment for what's best for us and the people around us.
Yes. So now that we're on the same page together around what people pleasing is, let's take a step back in time, really far back in time, and look at exploring what actually sits behind and where does people pleasing come from? What's the root of that? So in terms of research in threat responses, people pleasing has actually been connected to what's called the fawn response. And that's our body's natural inbuilt ways of handling stress and threats, along with the three other Fs known as fight, flight, and freeze, which you might be familiar with. So being social animals and having evolved within social groups, our environments of threat have changed very much over history. And that instinct, however, to appease others or to avoid those threats still remains strong within our brains and our minds. And it can still be a great serving for us to cope. As social beings, we're wired to seek that approval. So from a really young age, we might be trying to align with others and gain that acceptance that actually feels and early on is essential for our safety and belonging. But the fawn response taps into that need of leading us to appease or submit to others to avoid that conflict or rejection. So in today's world, if you consider your work context, your work environment, this instinct often kicks in with non-physical threats as well. Think social stress, fear of rejection, and over time it can become automatic. And that's where it can sort of start to turn into that people pleasing that we're talking about, where you're putting others' needs above your own. Let's take a quick look now at how this looks in the brain. So what you're looking at here, on the left, you've got your unstressed brain and your prefrontal cortex, your thinking, your planning, your strategic thinking is online, and then your stressed brain on the other side. So what actually happens when our brain detects that threat, anything from, in a work context, a looming deadline, it could be a tough conversation that you know that you need to have with a colleague or a boss, is the amygdala, that stress center of your brain that manages your emotions. It's actually getting activated and sounds that alarm, and it prompts your body to act. And in this state, your brain's response is to align with that other person, potentially, and to prioritize their needs over yours so that you can reduce that sense of threat from them. And that's that automatic response that pulls us into that default mode.
Yeah, thanks, Jonas. And so this specific fawn response, there can be a number of different contributing factors that trigger this in us, where we might have a predisposition to be pulled into this default as adults. So some of these you can see on the screen there, from early life experiences to social conditioning. What we mean by that is, if we think about society as well, being agreeable and helpful is often seen as a positive trait. So this reinforces people-pleasing tendencies in our brain because we associate it with social acceptance. And, you know, again, we're social beings and that's important to all of us. It's also, you know, this fear of rejection or conflict can predispose us to this tendency as well. Sometimes if we have anxiety or low self-esteem, so this is where maybe we don't feel confident in our own value. Maybe we want to seek approval from others as a way to kind of validate ourselves, is another really common way that we start to say yes to avoid the discomfort of maybe not feeling good enough. And lastly, cultural expectations. So there are certain cultures around the world where this idea of being selfless or agreeable or more accommodating is seen as really virtuous. And again, going back to that difference between default and intention, it's not the intention that we want to cut out, but that when we're, you know, culturally pulled into that default behavior where we start to prioritize other people's well-being well above our own, and it's coming at a cost to us.
Great. So absolutely, as we've seen here, people pleasing, as Tina's just taken us through, can often be generated by some of those factors that can contribute, and they'll often stem from those early life experiences. That can be the origin, there's social conditioning, or it might be that deep-rooted fear of rejection, of conflict. But by no means, while these tendencies develop in our early lives, they don't stop. They don't stop at the door, especially when we enter our workplaces, as many of us might experience. And in fact, the way that our workplaces are increasingly set up, many of us might feel some of those pressures, time pressures, and the dynamics of a workplace can actually increase and amplify some of those behaviors that we will fall into, whether that's seeking that approval from your boss or fear of that conflict with your colleague, as I mentioned earlier. So let's have a little bit of an exploration here of each of these different ways that it can show up at work. And as I go through these, I invite you to just note for yourself, potentially, which ones resonate most for you, or perhaps there's some that actually aren't listed here, and that might be experiences that you have. So one of those is overcommitting. That's one of the ways that it can show up. So this looks like, as I mentioned earlier, you're saying yes to almost every request. And that's even if you've already got a really full plate and you've got a lot of things that you're needing to take care of. What can happen there is that can lead to burnout at the far end. And in a less example, it might just be that you're missing those deadlines because you've said yes to too many things. A few other examples are that avoiding of conflict can show up. You might be seeking that validation from colleagues or bosses. Micromanaging or avoiding delegation is something that could be more relevant for those of you who are in leadership roles. So you might, for example, try to maintain tighter control and sort of looking at all those micro details that other people have the responsibility over. And that might be for a number of reasons. It can be to avoid being seen potentially as inadequate in your leadership role, or just to ensure that everybody's actually happy with the outcome. Another example is failing to set boundaries, something that we'll look in more detail at later in the session. And indecisiveness is something that it can look up as when you're in the workplace. So if there are any that are coming up for you, pop them in the chat box, ones that particularly resonate, perhaps ones that aren't listed there. Tina, were there any that really resonate for you in the workplace?
Yes, I think for me, the one that's still really current is the conflict avoidance. And it's funny because I was reflecting on this and I thought if anyone's done the Clifton Strengths, one of my top 2 is harmony, but to the point that I end up over-indexing in it. A historical one has been that overcommitment. So wanting to be seen as helpful and just saying yes to every request has, definitely been a big one of mine. Also as a fellow people pleaser, recovering person. Avoiding conflict, it's quite a common one, Linda. I'm curious though, of those of us on this call, just with a show of hands, who's in a position of leadership here?
Okay, seeing a few hands going up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a few of us there. If we could just stop sharing screen for a minute, Jonas, please. There we go. Yep. See all of your beautiful faces now. Yeah, so in terms of people pleasing showing up for us at work, if we consider leadership where, people are looking up to us and our impact arguably is even bigger, having a think about, okay, what are we actually role modeling for the people that we're leading? And so in terms of leadership, the most common ways that people pleasing shows up is that indecisiveness, is the inconsistent delegation, sometimes procrastination, which we did a previous webinar on. If you missed it, reach out, we can send that to you, and the conflict avoidance as well. And so having a think about the impact that can have and the ripple impact of our leadership when we're being pulled into this default people pleasing. I wanted to share quickly just an example where I worked with someone, I coached them earlier in the year. She was a senior manager. And at the time she came into coaching, she was feeling really overwhelmed. And she said that something that she was sensing a lot of time was this feeling of resentment. And she wasn't quite moving the needle on the things that were really important to her. She was putting in the hours, she was doing overtime, she had kids at home, and yet there was still these feelings of overwhelm, and she just felt like she wasn't really getting anywhere. And as we started to explore and we were asking some curious questions, what we started to learn was that she recognized she had this need she wanted to be liked by everyone, but even deeper than that, she had this need to be needed, like she liked to be needed. So she wanted people to constantly come to her, and she was saying yes to every request, but ultimately it wasn't really serving her. And it wasn't actually serving her team either, because it didn't allow them to, step into their capability and capacity and start to take on more of the work. So through the sessions, we started to take some small steps, and we will absolutely jump into some of these strategies later in the webinar. But one of them was learning to say no when necessary. And the other one was like starting to set some boundaries around her time and not saying yes to every request. And now, sounds obviously simple in theory, not as easy to apply, but she noticed over time and with support, as she started to apply these things, those feelings of overwhelm decreased. And then she noticed in her team what it actually enabled is it empowered them to step up. And there was this nice flow that began as a result of that. So it reminded me of that quote, and I shared this with her, and some of you may be familiar with, from Brené Brown, but wasn't a tongue twister to begin with, seems to be now. To be clear is to be kind. To be unclear is to be unkind. Is anyone here familiar or heard that before? Yeah, lots of nodding of the heads. So I think that we might hold on to that one, and we'll bring it back when we start to look at boundaries as one of the strategies.
Yes, absolutely. Just as you were sharing that story, and I think it's great for us to hear that story from you, Tina, because it grounds it in some of those practical examples and what more of the details and nuance around it can look like. And while you were sharing, I did notice there's a comment that came up in the chat that avoidance of delegation is interesting. I didn't think that would be a part of people pleasing. So avoiding of delegating as a leader, how could that actually be a part of people pleasing? It's an interesting one. For some, that might be an easy thing to do. For others, perhaps it could be a sign that we can't take care of something ourselves. That's just an example of some of the self-talk that could be there for some of us.
Yeah, or maybe like I'm not wanting to put someone else under pressure, or like I feel guilty for handing the work over. So again, it's that guilt of, I'll just do it myself because I don't want to put that on somebody else. So that's kind of the essence of people pleasing.
Absolutely. I think that's such a good point. So let's continue on and ask the question, how do we actually shift from that needing of approval to simply appreciating it if and when it comes our way, which I think that is, it's human, it's natural. I think that's fantastic. So for us in this session, the goal isn't to eliminate approval altogether, but it's for us to reach a place where we don't actually rely on that to feel secure and worthy. That's sort of the distinction we're going for. And that then allows us to focus on what's really important. That might be personal growth. It might be your authentic choices, where you can actually act according to your own values. And as we go, what I want to point out here, this is quite an important one, is that our hope is the strategies will start to work. You'll start to practice them, and you'll start to notice changes within yourself, maybe even others. And as you start to reduce some of your people-pleasing tendencies, people around you may actually start to react as well. So what do we mean by that? The thing is that not only ourselves, but other people have actually become used to our certain dynamic. So our saying yes to every response rather than just a few that work for us. And when we start to set those boundaries, even in small ways and in healthy ways, it can actually start to feel a bit uncomfortable. So that's normal. And that can be for both us, but also them. So that's just an extra added piece that we want to offer as well. And importantly, that discomfort is not a reason to revert back to your old ways. It's not a sign that anything is wrong. It's more likely a sign of growth, that you're actually getting somewhere and starting to stand in what matters to you and setting those boundaries. So let's jump into the first step of those practical strategies. What can we do? We're going to actually divide these into two main aspects, both internal foundations and external strategies. And we're starting with internal foundations because that will help you to build that basis, that foundation on which to use the strategies with other people. What underpins the internal ones is self-validation. So to practice self-validation, it allows you to affirm your inherent worth, essentially, and independent of others' opinions. It's about recognizing that your value, as it says here, doesn't come from what you do or from others' approval, but simply from who you are. I think that's a really important one to let sink in sometimes. And this concept's essential in cultivating that courage to be disliked, because if we've got that core of true belief in our worth, then being disliked can be okay sometimes. And to support us on this journey, we're going to look at, to begin with, what we call the 3 A's. Those are acknowledge, assess, and affirm. Okay, so these are 3 steps that can help you build stronger foundation from within, making it then easier to actually make decisions and honor your needs and your values going forwards.
So as we do, I'm curious again with a show of hands, who here has children or has spent time around babies, maybe nieces, nephews, friends, kids, quite a few hands going up. Safe to say most of us have spent time around children, babies. Now, if you haven't, I'm going to share a really cute picture of a baby. So looking at this baby and thinking about your experience when you've held a baby before or been around a baby, did you believe it is inherently valuable and worthy of love? Who believed that a baby is inherently valuable and worthy of love? Nodding, yes, hands are going up. Interesting. Very, very interesting, because these babies, they haven't contributed anything to society, have they? They've done nothing.
They don't pay taxes.
Yet, they're not trying to gain our approval, yet we still believe or see them as inherently valuable simply because they exist. So I just want to really pause and drive this point home, because this quality of worth is something that we all have. It's something that we're born with. But as we grow, and we spoke to some of those predispositions earlier, some of those, perhaps social conditioning, cultural expectations, early childhood experiences, it can lead us to believe that our worth is then dependent on what we achieve or how other people perceive us. But this is something that we all continue to have. And so the challenge is to reconnect with that inherent worth we all had. Remind ourselves that we don't need to prove our value through people pleasing or constant approval seeking. And when we validate ourselves from within, we're tapping into that unconditional worthiness. And that's what really sets us up and puts us in a position to then be able to manifest behaviors that are in alignment with that, externally putting boundaries when we get the internal foundations set. So hopefully, I'm going to share a scenario and I was going to say, hopefully it's not too activating for us, but relatable enough. Let's imagine ourselves, we're completely stretched at work. I mean, I'm sure none of us can relate to that. You've been juggling multiple projects. Maybe you haven't had a weekend free in the last 6 months. You've had to work weekends. Just when you're about to finish a critical task, a colleague shows up at your door. So for me, this would be Jonas. And barely waiting for a response before, they just walk in, they plop themselves down. They're like, hey, gosh, I'm really in a bind. I need someone to take over this project last minute. I mean, you're so brilliant. You're the only one with the expertise to handle it. I know you can take this on. Thanks so much. And you're like, whoa, like that's just very left field. And before you know it, your phone is like buzzing on your desk, and you see it's your, in my case, my brother. And you're like, oh God, it's unusual for them to call me during work hours. It must be something important. So you answer the call. And they're like, hey, I'm so stressed. I can't tell you right now, but something's gone on in the background, and I just can't host Christmas this year. I know we're a few months out. Please, you're so organized. I know you're on top of these things. You did such a good job last year. Please, can you just host Christmas for us this year? Thank you so much. I know you can pull it off. Hey, I got to run. Talk to you later. Love ya. And you're like, oh, in the space of 2 minutes, these 2 requests have just landed. There's this sense of urgency and pressure, right? And this is the tricky bit. There's this pressure on us to respond. And now I'm noticing from your nods and your laughs and your smiles that this was activating enough that we can relate to it. So either we've been there before, or we can see this playing out in our own dynamics. And this is where the 3A's process is really useful for us, those internal foundations. So let's carry this scenario through as we start to look at what these 3A's mean and how they show up. So the first one here is acknowledging our own perspective. This is when we're literally happened to me last weekend. Oh my goodness. So it's quite
given a trigger warning, Tina. Yeah.
In terms of acknowledging our perspective, it's taking a moment to pause and have a think about, this question of, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? Now let's hold this for a minute, and I'd love for you to type into the chat. If you say yes to either your colleague or your brother or your sister or sibling or family member, what are you saying no to? So for me, for example, if I said yes to Jonas, it might mean that I'm saying no to my weekends for the rest of the year. Or if I said yes to my brother to hosting Christmas, it's probably a bit harsh, but I'm saying no to my sanity, my peace of mind. But I'd love to hear from all of you. If you were to ask this question, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? What are the kinds of things that come up? Maybe it's your time, maybe it's your energy, your values, your well-being, saying no to family time, absolutely. So, and that might be a strong value for us. And so then this takes us to the second question of, based on this, what do I think is the right decision for me? My own needs, yeah, absolutely, Georgia. And if I didn't need anyone's approval, in the absence of people pleasing, what would I choose? If I step into that intention, what would I actually choose from that place? Yeah, probably say no to most things. Absolutely. And that's what we want to start to tap into, giving ourselves a bit of space to reflect on this. So we start to recognize the trade-offs. This is an essential step because it clarifies what we're sacrificing. And that's what helps us become discerning and pull us into more intentional decisions.
Yes, great. I love how many people are contributing. It's really great to see your honesty and openness, and maybe help you. For those who aren't actually putting something into the chat, you might be sitting back but going, oh my God, yes, that's me. I just didn't want to put it in there. So you're normalizing what we can all be going through. So the next step, once we've acknowledged, is to assess. That's the second of the 3A's. And this is all about assessing your feelings and your needs, which might be something you don't do very often if you tend towards people pleasing. And the key around here is, when you do this, is to start by tuning into your emotions, tuning into your body and your sensations, especially when you feel that urge, that impulse to jump into people pleasing, to say yes when you actually mean no. Some key questions that can help you with this these are examples. What am I feeling right now? Is it anxiety? Is it guilt? Is it a fear of rejection? It could be frustration. If you've got different examples, feel free to pop them into the chat box. And the following question is, given these feelings, given these sensations that I'm actually tuning into now and not ignoring, what do I need in this moment that I might be ignoring?
That's a good
So
one. Sorry to
Mm.
interrupt you. So you just put in fear of missing out. Yeah, that's a really real one as well.
Yeah, that's a big one. We might feel a yes because we might miss out on something, but we're saying no to something we need in a future moment. So with both of these, what we're doing is we're acknowledging our emotions, we're acknowledging our needs, and then we're actually starting, and this is all about repeating and practicing this, is we're reinforcing a message to our body and to ourselves that we are important, our needs are important, our feelings are important, and they deserve that attention. So they're more likely to send a clearer signal next time because they know they're going to be heard. So we've seen a few examples come through. That's fantastic. When you imagine yourself in that scenario, this might help you identify some of those feelings. Just notice what you started to feel. Even though Tina gave a scenario that wasn't real, because I would never do that to Tina, but just notice how you might feel in a similar situation. So if you do have any other ones that come up, pop them into the chat as well. That could be resentment or overwhelm or who knows, a whole host of others. What I'd like to do now is to just talk a little bit more about the next step, which is the third A, and that is to affirm. So remembering the image of the baby, for you it might be a new puppy that you've just bought and that you can't resist, and the worth is inherent in what you see in front of you. The key here is to catch yourself when you're seeking validation, when you're jumping to yes, and to actually pause. And you might ask yourself something like this: if I was worthy just by existing as a baby in the past, then I'm still worthy now. So for some reason, our inherent worth seems to be cut off at some arbitrary time as we grow up and start to pay taxes. And it's an interesting one to just question and to replace with these affirmations. And this is a simple reminder that can help you detach from your value being external, based on external approval, and for you to actually replace it by saying something else to yourself, like this, for example: my worth is not defined by what I do or what others think of me. My worth is not defined by what I do or what others think of me. So just notice what it's like to even see and hear those. But if you have an example of one of those resonating with you, let us know in the chat box. Or if you have something else that you might use to affirm your worth, that actually fits for you, or that someone else used in the past and you found particularly resonant or really impactful for you, do share that with us as well.
No, for me, Jonas, more recently, something that's come up is just reaffirming that I'm just as important, because I find when I get pulled into that default people pleasing, I'm kind of thinking that other people are more important or their needs are more important. So just reaffirming like my needs are also important, I'm just as important, has been really helpful. So that's one that I've been using as well. And yeah, I find this process is really helpful for us to be making intentional decisions that align with our values, and reinforcing essentially that self-worth. And sometimes this can take, a bit of time, bit of practice. Again, it might feel a little bit unfamiliar to begin with. But what this then sets us up is that strong foundation of self-worth, through the acknowledgement, through the assessing of the emotions and affirming our own needs, that we're then able to externally put things into action. So this is where we move into the 3 Ps. Do you see what we did there? 3 As, 3 Ps, alliteration? No, just me get excited about this stuff.
I'm excited too.
I thought it was brilliant, but anyway, this is what's designed to help us assert ourselves confidently and uphold the boundaries, that reflect our values. So this is what we want to go through now. The first one is the powerful pause. The second one is boundaries, and we did allude to that earlier in the session. So we really want to expand in that. How do we set boundaries? What's the process here? And then practicing saying no. Again, might seem simple enough, but a lot harder to apply in reality. So this is where it's important to start to shift our mindset and those internal foundations to make it easier for us to manifest these behaviors externally. So starting with the powerful pause. The reason it's so powerful is because it helps us create space between the request and the expectation and the pressure of that response. So taking back a few steps to that scenario I shared before, and you're under this pressure, and sometimes when you're in that default, the yes slips out even before you intend it to. So just taking a moment to pause, taking a deep breath. What Jonas spoke to, that amygdala hijack. By taking a breath, we can start to reverse that. We can start to bring our prefrontal cortex back online, our wise brain, and just really interrupt that pattern, that people-pleasing reaction that, pulls us into doing things that aren't in alignment with us. So this is the autopilot we want to mitigate through taking a breath. And then what we might try, sometimes that can be enough. What we might try out on here is using a buffer phrase. What I mean by a buffer phrase, so again, in that earlier scenario, I might say something like, hey, I appreciate that you need my help on this, but I just need a minute to think about it. Or let me get back to you. Or I might say, hey, I might call my brother back and say, hey, appreciate the request, but I actually have to look at my calendar, and I'll get back to you tomorrow. And so what this does, again, is it buys us time to then maybe go back to the 3 A's process and ask that question of, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? And really reflect, do I really want to do this? Or am I just afraid to say no? What's driving this decision? Is it fear or is it intention? Is it intentional choice? Then no, actually, I truly want to do this because it's in alignment with me and my values. So it's a simple strategy, but it's a really effective one that helps us pattern interrupt that default response and allow our brain to switch over to that higher functioning where we can make more considerate and aligned responses.
Great, thanks, Tina. So you've managed to be able to pause, to take a breath, to start to bring back down that neocortex that's able to make a decision based on what you actually need and feel in that moment. So what can happen next? So the second P in the 3 Ps is what we're calling protect with boundaries. And at this moment, I want to just mention that it's arguable that at the basis of all healthy and respectful relationships, whether that's with others in your workplace, whether that's people in your life, whether that's with yourself, underneath all that is a learnable skill of setting and holding boundaries. I think setting is one piece, but sometimes we might not be very good at holding boundaries. So if that's relevant to you, this is an important one as well. And I'm showing here a picture of what I think is a very lush, beautiful garden. I'm so curious to know what's further in the background. I feel drawn in. So it's a beautiful, nourishing garden, and there's a fence around it. And I want to bring that analogy in here. So you can actually think of healthy boundaries like the fence around your garden. And your garden is where you nurture your own well-being. That's your time, that's your energy, and your emotional space. Without a fence, anyone could just walk into your garden. They could just go, like Tina could just walk into my garden. She could trample on my plants. She could just take what she needs. But if I build a strong yet flexible fence around my garden with a gate, then I can still let Tina or other people in my workplace in, metaphorically. But I can do that on my terms. So I'm protecting what's important at the same time as allowing some people to come in and seek support at times. So I'm setting boundaries. It doesn't shut people out. It just ensures that your garden can continue to thrive. And at the same time, you're choosing who can actually get to come into your garden, how they come in, when they do, when they don't, all those sorts of things. So I think that's a really helpful analogy. And for the purpose of our session today, in terms of boundaries, a definition. So a boundary is your sense of what's okay and what's not okay for you. And sometimes that can actually mean the actions that you'll take when that line is crossed. And this is one that I think is really important to underline, and a good one to take away, is that setting personal boundaries means changing how you respond to situations rather than expecting others to change their behavior. I think that's one that can sometimes trip us up in terms of, I set a boundary, but they still did the thing. It's about how you respond. And we want to start to reflect on what's important to us to articulate a boundary. We talked about pausing. And this may sound simple, but it's not always easy to do. So stopping and thinking what is important to us, it can actually build clarity for us around what our boundaries actually are. So to communicate our boundaries and to say no with conviction, what can really help is to know why you're setting a boundary or saying no. For some of us, we might be able to start practicing saying no, but having a reason that you're doing that can really help. Tina, you've got an example of how this was helpful for you?
Yeah, I think as I shared earlier, that overcommitment is historically problematic for me, especially in the context of work and being a single parent. Knowing that that's why I'm saying no has been really helpful. So, you know, I can't do late nights, so I can easily say no now because I have the clarity that actually I'm protecting important time with my son, and having that allows me to say no. I'm not going to lie and say easily, but that why eases the guilt and the discomfort.
Good distinction there. Yeah. So and even just hearing you describe it then, I heard that conviction. That was true for you. And for some of you in the webinar today, you might also have that conviction. There's some things you're like, I can definitely say no to that, have no trouble. Or as Tina said, it's still not easy, but you have enough conviction and a why to do that. But even if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I have to say no to this report or that request, and I'm actually not that clear on the reason why, that's okay, because you can still practice pausing in the moment at the very least, as we did earlier. So an example to help you articulate what your boundary is a little bit of a wording that can help you with some gaps in between. You're all going to receive a workbook after this session, so you'll be able to have this as an opportunity to build and practice. What you can see here is an example. So my value, what's important to me is this. So my boundary is, and this is where you would describe your boundary. And therefore this means that I will say or do X. So that's just a way to help you to start to craft your boundary in a more clear, concise way for you to use later. A few examples that we've got here of what that might sound like. If in the example that Tina gave earlier, where I put some extra work on her, but we can imagine it's flipped, I can just think, wow, balance is actually really important to me. And I'm just noticing that, Tina, coming in here. So my boundary is not taking on additional work when I'm already at full capacity. And so what I will do is to tell Tina that I can't actually take on anything else at this time. Okay, so it's helped me break that down. And there's another example there that you can use as well. That'll be in your workbooks. So this is something you can do in your own time. And just remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's about refining and returning to this over time to make that even more effective for you. Tina.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jonas. So last, we've got the practice of saying no. And again, this taps back into this avoidance to say no because of the discomfort that comes along with emotions like guilt or fear. And so underneath it, we're wanting to avoid those emotions. And that's a driver for us to go into that default of people pleasing. And it makes it a lot harder to set those boundaries and prioritize our needs. So this practice of saying no is where we might also be helpful to check into the 3As again, and assess the emotions that are emerging for us. But the key here is that even in the presence of some of those emotions, we can still say no. So I can hold space for the guilt that I feel and still say no. I can still act in spite of that. And so what might make it easier for us to start to flex this muscle, because that's what this practice is, flexing that muscle, and the more we do it, the stronger we get, is to say no to little requests that maybe don't carry as much weight. So it could be saying no to a favor, like maybe somebody borrowing your car, as we saw in that reel. We can be polite and firm. Sometimes we have this fear that if we say no, it's going to be seen as impolite. But we say, hey, sorry, I can't do that this time. We don't have to be rude about it and be like, no, how dare you ask me that? And lastly, just again, resist that guilt, understand what the guilt is trying to pull us into that default, and really tap into knowing that just because we say no doesn't make us a bad person. It just means we're respecting our own limits, and that's okay. So this is also an opportunity where we might want to communicate our boundaries, but it's not necessary, because we might risk going into that over-explaining, again, that we saw in the reel and that some of us resonated with. So we want to resist that temptation, but we might give context to why we're saying no if we've formulated and have clarity on that boundary. So through this consistent practice, we can start to feel really empowered, gain some confidence, protect our time, and hopefully start to reduce those feelings of resentment and exhaustion.
Great. So let's just have a recap of where we've been so far. We've looked at the internal foundations that are important first, the 3 A's of affirm, assess, and acknowledge. And then we looked at those external actions that you can start putting into place and practicing, the 3 P's of a powerful pause, protecting your boundaries by actually articulating what it is they are, and practice saying no, even in small ways. But these are all good strategies for managing our own people-pleasing tendencies. What can we do to notice a colleague, a direct report, someone on your team falling into those people-pleasing patterns? What can we do to help them?
Yeah, so going back to that context of work, if we're a leader, or even if we're just in a team where we notice this is showing, we're recognizing these tendencies in other people, there's 2 larger ways that we can respond to it. So the 2 categories, first is cultivating that culture of clarity and modeling healthy boundaries, and then the latter 2, compassionate curiosity and offer to collaborate on prioritization. So in terms of the first 2, creating a culture of clarity, it might look like maybe you're in a team meeting and you ask a question, hey, does anyone need some help balancing priorities this week? So what we're wanting to tap into is just to normalize sharing limits and help prevent that overcommitment. We also want to, especially if we're in a position of leadership, understand the influence we have as a leader and start to model really healthy boundaries. So the best way to show our team that is through us doing it ourselves. For example, I might say, look, I'm not available after 6 p.m. tonight. Let's tackle this, any urgent issues first thing tomorrow morning. I know for myself, when I started to get really clear and set some boundaries around my time of like, actually, I'm not available to be able to do that on the weekend, I actually got a lot of feedback from other team members saying, I really admire your courage to set those boundaries, and allowed them to then also set some of their own. And so not underestimating the influence that we can have in this regard. So what if we notice someone else who's maybe regularly prioritizing others at the cost of their own well-being? How can we as a colleague help them?
Yes, so as I mentioned some of these examples, the compassionate curiosity and offering to a collaborative approach or prioritization, you might have other ideas that you've tried that have worked, that others have tried. Do share those in the chat as well. There's a couple of things we can try here, and that is compassionate curiosity. So the approach, as it says here, is to approach them with curiosity rather than assumption. We're trying to ask those open-ended, non-judgmental questions. And an example here you can see is, I've noticed you've been taking on a lot lately, Tina. How are you feeling about your workload? Okay, so I'm using the open questions starting with how. And that can help Tina or whoever it might be reflect on their own patterns without feeling accused or needing to become defensive. Offer to collaborate on prioritization. So this one's a really interesting one. It sort of takes it to another level where you're actually gently suggesting the idea of collaboration around just having a talk, having a conversation about priorities and what theirs are and how they're going. So sometimes those of us who tend towards people pleasing may not even realize when we're taking on too much. It's sort of a slow creep, like the idea of a boiling frog, that we seem, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, and then suddenly I'm not. So you're coming in when they're lukewarm and you're asking that question. You're offering to clarify for them. It might sound something like, it seems like you've been juggling a lot of requests for different people, Tina. You're juggling balls, plates, and kittens every time I look at your desk. Would it help to take a moment? Maybe we can review what's most urgent for you. Maybe we can look at what could wait. Maybe we can even figure out how to focus on things so you're not spread too thin. How does that sound? Okay, so just notice that example there. Both of these strategies respect your colleagues' autonomy or your team's autonomy, while gently encouraging some of that self-reflection around healthier boundary setting.
Yes, thank you, Ernest. And the reason he mentioned kittens, but what he was actually meaning to say is puppies, because I got a new puppy this week. So this brings us to the tail end of our webinar today. Now, before we wrap up, we would love to hear from you what's been of value or what's been most interesting that we covered in the session. And before you run off, as with the previous webinars as well, please don't forget our feedback QR code, which is just there on the screen. So by filling this out, probably take about 5 minutes. We really value your feedback and your input so we can continue to improve. But you'll also go into the draw to win a 3-session coaching package, as with the previous sessions, with one of our executive coaches at Performance Frontiers. So please feel free to share your feedback. Would love to hear from you. And on that, to hear from you, Jonas is just going to share another slide with our details. So please reach out if you have any questions, if you need any support that maybe you're not wanting to share in this forum. Our LinkedIn is there, our emails are there. Please reach out, add us on LinkedIn, connect with us. We'd love to hear from you. From myself, Jonas, and the entire Performance Frontiers team, thank you so much for giving up your time, spending it with us today. I genuinely really hope that there was something in this webinar that you're able to take away and apply to not only support yourself, but your teams out there and create some real impact and mitigating people pleasing. Thank you, everyone.